I spent almost a year believing 65 pounds stood between me and love. But when the scale finally read 183, the strangest thing happened. The number was no longer the most important thing in the room. I stood barefoot in my Portland apartment on a cold Thursday morning, staring down at the scale as if it had forgotten to deliver the life-changing moment I had been promised. 248 pounds had become 183. I had reached the finish line. Yet beside my bedroom door sat an old acoustic guitar in a worn black case. And on my phone was an email confirming that I was scheduled to perform an original song at a local music night on Friday. Somehow, those things made my heart beat faster than the scale did. 11 months earlier, I would not have believed any of this. Back then, I was Daniel Parker, 28 years old, 248 pounds, working as a copywriter from a small apartment in Portland, Oregon. Technically, my life functioned. I met deadlines. I paid rent. I ordered groceries. I answered my mother's calls often enough that she did not worry. But I had developed a habit of postponing everything that might make me feel exposed. I stopped dating. I declined invitations. I volunteered to take group photographs so I would not have to stand in them. Most painfully, I stopped playing guitar. In college, music had been the one place where I never wondered whether I belonged. Then confidence slowly disappeared, and my guitar ended up in the closet beneath winter coats and boxes I never unpacked. I kept telling myself I would play again when I felt better about myself. Someday became years. Then, on a rainy Monday morning, I met Matthew Collins. I had gone to a neighborhood coffee shop because working from my apartment felt especially lonely that day. I was wearing headphones and quietly listening to an old recording of a song I had written in college when the man at the next table glanced toward me. He was 31, dark-haired, calm-looking, and dressed in a charcoal jacket still dotted with rain. I realized I had been tapping the rhythm against my coffee cup. "Musician?" he asked. I almost laughed. "Not anymore." He nodded toward my headphones. "What happened?" I gave him the answer I usually gave myself. "Work got busy. Life happened. I lost interest." He listened, then asked one question that made every excuse sound suddenly hollow. "Why did you stop playing if you still miss it?" I looked at him and had absolutely nothing to say. Matthew introduced himself a few minutes later. I told him my name. We talked briefly about music, and then he left for work. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes. It should have meant nothing. Instead, that evening I opened my closet and stared at the black guitar case beneath my coats. I did not take it out. Not yet. But for the first time in years, I touched the handle. The next morning, I returned to the coffee shop. Matthew was already there. He looked up, recognized me immediately, and smiled. "Morning, Daniel." I had spent years waiting to become someone worth noticing. I did not understand yet that Matthew had noticed me before I changed anything at all. For the next several weeks, I became very good at pretending I returned to that coffee shop because it was easier to work there. Matthew usually arrived before 8, ordered black coffee, and claimed the table near the window whenever it was available. Our conversations slowly stretched from a few minutes into entire coffee breaks. I learned that he worked as a physical therapist at a rehabilitation clinic across town, loved old vinyl records, and had an unreasonable loyalty to terrible diner coffee. He learned that I hated video meetings, called my mother every Sunday, and once played guitar with a college band that never made it farther than 3 crowded bars and 1 disastrous campus festival. What surprised me was how much Matthew remembered. If I mentioned a difficult client on Tuesday, he asked about it Friday. If I named a song I loved, he listened to it. One morning, he nodded toward my hands and asked, "Have you opened the guitar case yet?" I smiled despite myself. "You remember everything. Only the interesting things." That sentence followed me home. The more time I spent with Matthew, the more I wanted those mornings to mean something, and the more convinced I became that they probably did not. Matthew seemed comfortable everywhere I felt awkward. He was fit without making fitness his personality, easy with strangers, and confident without demanding attention. I liked him enough to become frightened of wanting more. Then he invited me to a small Friday gathering for his friend Rachel at a brewery in Southeast Portland. My first instinct was to invent an excuse. Instead, I said yes. I changed shirts 4 times before leaving my apartment and nearly turned around outside the brewery. Matthew spotted me through the window and waved, so I went inside. For the first hour, I actually enjoyed myself. Matthew introduced me as Daniel, the musician I told you about, and hearing that word made me laugh because I had not played seriously in years. Then Connor arrived. He was tall, athletic, well-dressed, and carried himself with the kind of effortless confidence I had spent years trying to imitate. Matthew greeted him warmly, and within minutes they were laughing over some shared story. Nobody excluded me. Connor was friendly when Matthew introduced us. None of that stopped my mind from creating an explanation. I looked at Connor, then at Matthew, then down at the shirt I had spent 20 minutes choosing. Of course, I thought, someone like Matthew would want someone like him. I left earlier than planned and blamed an unfinished project. At home, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and realized I had done something painfully familiar. Matthew had never rejected me. I had done it for him. Still, instead of questioning that belief, I turned it into a plan. I stepped onto the scale, 248 pounds. Then I opened a note on my phone and typed a second number beneath it, 183, 65 pounds. I stared at the difference and imagined a future version of myself walking confidently into that brewery, standing beside Matthew, without comparison or fear. I told myself that when I reached 183, I would finally say what I felt. I did not understand that night that I had just attached permission to live to a number, or that the man I was trying to become had never been the man Matthew was waiting to meet. The morning after I wrote 183, beneath 248, I discovered that changing my life was much less dramatic than deciding to change it. There was no perfect beginning, no sudden confidence, and no version of me who woke up excited to exercise before work. There was only a rainy Portland morning and a pair of sneakers I had barely used. I walked for 20 minutes around my neighborhood, came home damp and tired, and counted it anyway. The next day, I did it again. Over the following weeks, I focused on changes I could repeat instead of promises I could not maintain. I walked farther, cooked more meals at home, kept a steadier sleep schedule, and stopped treating one imperfect day as an excuse to abandon the entire week. When I lost 15 pounds, climbing the stairs to my apartment became easier. At 25, I bought a shirt because I actually liked it instead of choosing whatever helped me disappear. Matthew noticed the shirt, but not in the way I had secretly hoped. "New look?" he asked over coffee. I tried to sound casual. "Something like that." Then he immediately added, "Did you open the guitar case?" I laughed. "You really are not going to forget that, are you?" "No chance." That evening, I finally pulled the case from the closet. Dust had gathered along the edges. I sat on my couch with the guitar across my lap and played one chord. My fingers felt awkward. The second chord sounded worse. I nearly put it away, but then I remembered Matthew asking why I had stopped if I still missed it. I played for 20 minutes. By 35 pounds, coworkers who only saw me through video meetings started commenting on how different I looked. My mother noticed during Sunday dinner and told me she was proud that I seemed happier. I was proud too, but part of me still measured every improvement against the same private question. Would Matthew see me differently now? At 45 pounds down, I found an open mic night at a small neighborhood venue. I spent 3 days considering it, and another 2 convincing myself I was only going to watch. Matthew came with me. We sat near the back while strangers played folk songs, covers, and imperfect originals. Halfway through the evening, he leaned toward me and said, "You should do this." My stomach tightened. "Absolutely not." "Not tonight," he said. "Someday." I looked toward the stage. For years, being seen had felt like the worst possible outcome. Now, for the first time, part of me wondered what it would feel like to stop hiding. The following morning, Matthew never asked how much weight I had lost. He asked which song I would play if I ever stepped onto that stage. I already knew the answer. It was an old song I had written in college and never finished. That night, I took out my guitar and worked on the missing verse. I told myself I was still doing all of this so that one day I could stand beside Matthew without feeling inadequate. But somewhere between the morning walks and unfinished chords, something inconvenient had begun to happen. The life I was rebuilding for him was starting to feel like mine. By the time I had lost 50 pounds, people had started speaking to me as if I had become someone new, but Matthew kept talking to me as if I had finally returned. Coworkers noticed my face on video calls. Friends noticed that my old jackets hung differently. My mother noticed that I no longer searched for excuses when she wanted a family picture. Matthew noticed that I had finished the missing verse of my song. "Play it for me," he said one Saturday morning at the coffee shop. I nearly spilled my coffee. "Absolutely not." He smiled. "You are willing to play for strangers at an open mic, but not for me?" The problem was that I had finally signed up. After weeks of watching other musicians take the stage, I had put my name on the list for Thursday night. Matthew came early and took a table near the back, exactly where we had sat the first time. When my name was called, every old instinct told me to stay seated. Instead, I carried my guitar to the microphone. My hands shook during the first few chords, and my voice sounded unfamiliar in the room, but then I stopped watching the audience. I listened to the song. 3 minutes later, I finished to warm applause and looked toward Matthew. He was standing beside his table, smiling so widely that I started laughing. Outside afterward, Portland was cold and wet, the pavement reflecting red and gold signs from nearby businesses. You were right, I told him. About what? I missed it. Matthew shook his head. I was not talking about the guitar. I looked at him. Then what were you talking about? His expression softened. You. For a moment, neither of us moved. I had spent months imagining what confidence would feel like when I finally became the person I wanted Matthew to see. Yet standing there with my guitar case in one hand and rain collecting on my jacket, I felt more exposed than ever. Matthew stepped slightly closer. There was nothing dramatic about it. No grand declaration. Just a quiet change in the space between us and a question in his eyes that I was suddenly terrified to answer. I thought about Connor. I thought about 248. Then I thought about the number I had seen that morning, 198. 50 pounds gone. 15 remaining. My mind transformed those 15 pounds into a wall. I stepped backward. Matthew noticed immediately and stopped. He did not follow me. He simply nodded and asked if I wanted him to walk me to my car. I said yes, and we talked about the performance as if nothing had happened. Later that night, I sat on my bed with the guitar beside me and opened the note on my phone. 248, 183. I added 198 between them. I should have felt proud. Instead, I remembered Matthew saying, you. Everyone else seemed impressed by the man I was becoming. Matthew had been looking for the man I had abandoned. And somehow, with only 15 pounds left, I was more frightened than ever that reaching my goal would not fix the part of me that still believed love required permission. The final 15 pounds should have felt easier because I had already proven I could change, but instead they became the most exhausting part of the journey. I started checking the scale more often than I needed to. A normal fluctuation could affect my mood before I had even made coffee. I still walked, cooked meals at home, and kept the routines that had helped me feel stronger, but somewhere along the way I stopped asking whether those habits made my life better and started asking whether they moved me closer to 183. Matthew noticed. Of course he did. One Friday evening, we met for dinner at a neighborhood restaurant after work. He told me about a patient at the rehabilitation clinic who had finally returned to an activity he loved, but I barely followed the story because I was distracted by my own thoughts. Matthew eventually set down his fork. Daniel, where are you? I looked at him. I am sitting right here. Your chair is. I am not sure about the rest of you. I tried to laugh, but he did not. His expression was gentle rather than judgmental, which somehow made honesty harder. I am just frustrated, I admitted. The scale has barely moved this week. Matthew was quiet for a moment. And what happens if it does not move next week? Then I keep going. Until 183? Yes. He leaned back slightly. And then what? I had answered that question 1,000 times inside my head. Then I would be confident. Then I would stop comparing myself to men like Connor. Then I would tell Matthew how I felt. But sitting across from the person at the center of that plan, I could not say any of it. A few days later, I almost skipped another open mic night because I wanted to get up early for an extra walk. I had my jacket on when I saw the guitar case beside the door. For months, that guitar had represented everything I was recovering. Now I was about to leave it behind because a number had become more important again. I went to the open mic. I played the same unfinished college song, except it was not unfinished anymore. When I stepped outside afterward, Matthew was waiting beneath the awning. You sounded different tonight, he said. Better. Freer. I smiled, but he kept looking at me. You know you do not have to earn every good thing that happens to you, right? The words landed too close to something I had been avoiding. I know. Matthew shook his head gently. I do not think you do. That night, I opened the note on my phone. The scale had read 193 that morning. 55 pounds gone. 10 remaining. I stared at 183 and realized I had turned the finish line into another hiding place. At 248, I told myself I could not live until I changed. At 193, I was still saying the same thing with better clothes, stronger legs, and a guitar back in my hands. Matthew had watched me reclaim pieces of myself for months, yet I was still withholding the one truth that mattered most. I closed the note and opened our message thread instead. My hands trembled as I typed 6 words I had avoided since the brewery. Can we talk tomorrow morning? His reply came less than a minute later. Of course. Same coffee shop. I looked at the guitar beside my couch, then at my reflection in the dark window. For the first time, I understood that losing the final 10 pounds was not the difficult part. The difficult part was telling Matthew why I had started. The next morning, Matthew was already sitting at our usual table when I entered the coffee shop. Portland rain streaked the windows behind him, and for one ridiculous second I considered pretending I had only stopped in for coffee. Then he saw me and smiled. I sat across from him, wrapped both hands around my cup, and said, "There is something I should have told you months ago." Matthew did not interrupt. I told him about Rachel's gathering, about seeing Connor beside him, and about deciding that a man who looked like Connor made more sense beside someone like Matthew than I ever could. Then I told him what happened after I went home. I weighed 248 pounds, I said. I wrote 183 underneath it. Matthew's expression changed. Why 183? Because it was 65 pounds away. I looked down at my coffee. I convinced myself that if I could lose 65 pounds, I would finally become confident enough to tell you how I felt. Silence settled between us. There was no graceful way to finish, so I forced myself to say the part that frightened me most. I changed because I wanted to become someone you could love. Matthew stared at me for several seconds, not angry, just stunned. Then he said, "Daniel, I already wanted you." I looked up. What? Before the walks? Before the new clothes? Before the open mic? Before you lost anything? My mind immediately searched for the flaw in his answer. Then what about Connor? Matthew blinked. Connor, at Rachel's gathering. You two were laughing together. Understanding crossed his face, followed by disbelief. Daniel, Connor is a friend. That is all he has ever been. Months of comparison collapsed in one sentence. Matthew leaned forward. Do you know why I kept going back to this coffee shop after we met? I shook my head. Because I hoped you would be here. I could barely process that. Matthew reminded me of our first conversation, when I had been tapping a rhythm against my coffee cup while listening to an old recording. You talked about music for 10 minutes like it was the only thing in the world, he said. Then you told me you did not play anymore, and you looked like you missed a part of yourself. He paused. I wanted to know that person, not some future version of him. I thought about every pound I had treated as distance between us. Matthew reached one hand across the table but stopped halfway, leaving the choice to me. I am glad you feel stronger, he said. I am glad you are playing again. If you want to keep working toward 183 because that goal matters to you, that is your decision. But Daniel, my feelings are not waiting there. I looked at his hand and slowly placed mine over it. Relief came first, followed almost immediately by something more complicated. For months, Matthew had been the reason I imagined at the finish line. Now he had removed himself from it. I still had 10 pounds remaining, a guitar beside my apartment door, and a life that had become larger than the plan that started it. As I sat across from the man I had wanted all along, one question became impossible to ignore. If Matthew had never needed me to become someone else, I had to decide whether I still wanted this journey when the only person left to finish it for was me. For several days after that conversation, I felt strangely unsteady, as if someone had removed the destination from a road I had been following for months. Matthew had admitted he wanted me, and every fantasy I had built around that possibility told me I should immediately let myself have what I had wanted. Instead, I asked him to meet me along the East Bank Esplanade that Sunday afternoon. Portland was cool and cloudy, with the Willamette River moving quietly beside us as cyclists and families passed. I told Matthew I cared about him, but I needed time before we became anything more. He looked disappointed, and seeing that nearly changed my mind. I spent months making you the reason for everything, I explained. If we start something now, I am afraid part of me will still believe your feelings prove the plan worked. Matthew listened without interrupting. I need to know the walking, the music, and the life I am building still belong to me when you are not standing there. He looked toward the river, then back at me. Then make them yours. We agreed to give each other some space. The first week was harder than I expected. Every time I heard a song Matthew would like, I reached for my phone. Every time something funny happened at work, I wanted to tell him. I avoided our coffee shop because I knew I would search for him the moment I entered. But gradually, the silence stopped feeling empty. I kept walking because I liked the way Portland looked early in the morning, especially when rain made the streets shine beneath traffic lights. I kept cooking because I felt better when I took care of myself. I went to Sunday dinner with my mother and ate without mentally turning the meal into a test. I played another open mic without checking whether Matthew might be in the audience. Halfway through my song, I realized I was not performing for anyone's approval. I was simply playing because I loved playing. A coworker invited me to a trivia night, and I went. I spent a Saturday afternoon browsing records alone. I even joined a small songwriting group that met twice a month, something the version of me at 248 pounds would have dismissed before anyone could reject him. My weight continued changing slowly, but I stopped checking every morning. Some weeks I made progress. Other weeks the number barely moved. My life kept moving anyway. One evening, after practicing the song I had written in college, I opened the old note on my phone. 248, 183. Beneath those numbers, I typed a sentence. You are allowed to stop. I stared at it for a long time. Nothing terrible happened. I was still Daniel. I still had music. I still had people who cared about me. And Matthew's feelings did not disappear because I gave myself permission to choose differently. That was when I understood something I had missed from the beginning. Continuing only mattered if stopping was truly allowed. I still wanted to reach 183, but the reason had changed. I wanted to finish a promise I had freely chosen for myself, not complete an audition for love. I put the phone down, picked up my guitar, and started writing a new song. For the first time, I did not wonder whether Matthew would like it. I only wondered whether it sounded like me. 3 months after I gave myself permission to stop, I woke on an ordinary Thursday morning and stepped onto the scale without expecting anything important. The number settled at 183. I stared at it, waiting for the rush I had imagined since the night after Rachel's gathering. 65 pounds were gone. I had reached the number that once represented confidence, courage, and the right to tell Matthew how I felt. Instead of feeling transformed, I mostly felt quiet. I stepped off the scale, made coffee, and opened my laptop for work. I did not photograph the number. I did not send it to Matthew. By noon, I had almost forgotten about it because something else mattered more. The following evening, I was scheduled to perform an original song at a local music night. It was the first song I had written completely from scratch since college, and unlike everything I had played during the previous months, Matthew had never heard it. Friday night, I arrived early with my guitar and found the small venue already filling with people. My mother had taken a table near the front. 2 co-workers were sitting nearby, and several people from my songwriting group waved when they saw me. Months earlier, that many familiar faces would have made me want to disappear. Now they made me feel supported. When my name was called, I carried my guitar onto the stage, adjusted the microphone, and looked across the room. That was when I saw Matthew standing near the back. My heart stumbled. For a moment, every old instinct returned. I wondered what he thought of how I looked. I wondered whether he knew I had reached 183. Then I remembered why I had written the song. I turned toward the microphone and began playing. The first verse was about waiting for permission. The second was about mistaking change for worth. By the final chorus, I was no longer searching the room for Matthew. I was listening to my own voice. When the song ended, the applause felt warm and immediate. I thanked everyone, carried my guitar off stage, hugged my mother, and talked with my friends before I finally walked toward Matthew. He smiled as I approached. That was yours. Every word. It sounded like you. Months earlier, those words would have felt like a compliment I needed. Now they felt like recognition. I reached 183 yesterday, I told him. Matthew's eyebrows lifted. 65 pounds. I nodded. Congratulations. Then he smiled slightly. But I am guessing that is not why you asked me to come tonight. I looked back at the stage. No, I wanted you to hear the song. We stood quietly for a moment before I said what I had spent 3 months learning how to mean. I still want you, Matthew. But I do not need you to prove any of this worked. His expression softened. Good. Because I never wanted to be the prize. I laughed, and the last of my nervousness disappeared. I reached for his hand. This time, there was no number left to hide behind, and no future version of myself waiting to become worthy. I had reached 183, But the real finish line had been crossed before I ever stepped onto the scale that morning. It happened when I walked onto that stage knowing Matthew was in the room and finished my song without needing him to make it matter. 6 months later, Matthew sat near the back of the same Portland venue where I had once needed every ounce of courage just to walk onto the stage. I saw him before I played my first chord. He was wearing the charcoal jacket I remembered from the morning we met, and when our eyes met, he smiled without waving or trying to pull my attention away from the room. By then, he knew I did not need reassurance before performing. I only needed him to be there as himself. Our relationship had become wonderfully ordinary. We made dinner together after work, took long weekend walks. When Portland weather cooperated, argued about music with completely unnecessary seriousness, and occasionally returned to the coffee shop where we first met. Matthew still worked at the rehabilitation clinic. I still worked as a copywriter, although music had become a permanent part of my schedule again. I played local open mic nights twice a month, met regularly with my songwriting group, and had recently been invited to perform a short set at a neighborhood arts festival. My weight moved slightly from week to week, but I no longer checked it every morning. The scale remained in my bathroom, quietly existing without having an opinion about me. I kept walking because I liked early mornings. I cooked because I enjoyed taking care of myself. I also shared pizza with Matthew, ate my mother's birthday cake, and understood that an ordinary meal did not require negotiation or guilt. That evening, I adjusted the microphone and looked across the audience. Months earlier, I had imagined becoming a different man before allowing myself to stand where I was standing now. Instead, I had discovered that change did not erase the old Daniel. It brought him back. I began playing the song I had written during the months Matthew and I spent apart. The first line still reminded me of the apartment where my guitar had disappeared beneath winter coats. The middle reminded me of rainy walks, coffee shop mornings, and the number 183 glowing on a bathroom scale that had once seemed capable of deciding my future. Then I reached the final verse and looked toward Matthew. He was listening with the same expression he had worn the first time I talked about music, as if what interested him had never been the person I might become, but the person speaking in front of him. I smiled and continued playing. I did not dedicate the song to him. I did not need to. When the final chord faded, I stayed beneath the stage lights for a moment and let myself be seen. Afterward, Matthew waited while I packed my guitar. Outside, rain had started falling lightly over Portland. He slipped his hands into his jacket pockets and asked, "Coffee?" I laughed. "At this hour? Terrible diner coffee. That somehow makes it worse." We started walking anyway. At the corner, I caught our reflections together in a dark storefront window. Once, I would have inspected my body first and wondered whether I looked like someone who belonged beside him. This time, I saw two men walking through the rain, laughing about bad coffee and heading somewhere together. Matthew had awakened a part of me I thought I had lost, but he had never demanded that I rebuild myself for his love. The 65 pounds were part of my journey, not the price of admission to his heart. I looked away from the reflection and kept walking beside him, finally understanding that the greatest change was not becoming someone Matthew could love. It was becoming someone I no longer wanted to hide.